Hello and welcome to another lesson in ecosystems, biodiversity and management. This session is going to be looking at the importance of the tropical rainforest ecosystem. It follows on from the lesson we'd looked at, which was just a good introduction into the characteristics of the tropical rainforests. So their structure, their nutrient cycle, their soil type, as well as some of the species of animal and plant that live there. So looking at now why the tropical rainforests are such an important resource for us as humans is really critical to understanding why we need to protect them. But also we're going to start to look at some of the threats posed to the tropical rainforest ecosystem by climate change in this session. So the first thing we're going to do is, using this topic as a kind of vehicle, I've got 3 photographs which are on 365, so please find that resource on 365, and each photograph is a different angled photograph. They're either an aerial photograph, an oblique photograph, or a ground level photograph. So the first thing I'd like you to do is cut them out, stick them in your book, and try and work out which is which. But more importantly, for each photograph, I would like you to try and work out one advantage and one disadvantage that each photograph has with regards to the information it shows you. Okay, so pause the screen, have a go at that, and when you're ready, I'll go through the answers. Okay, so just to tell you which is which, first of all, this top one here, this is an oblique angle photograph. This one is a ground level photograph. And this one is an aerial photograph. And I've got some other examples to show you for that in a second, and I'll also go through some disadvantages and advantages of each. So aerial photographs, first and foremost, are photographs taken directly from above. So in these 3, the aerial photograph is the middle one here. They are really good because they show substantial detail. I can see from this image, for example, that there's a river here, there's roads and bridges and stuff here, there's a park or a green space here with a lake in it. I can see all sorts of detail, and also I can just very quickly see the difference in terms of land use. In your photograph, you can see there's clearly a patch of either different woodland or probably diseased or unhealthy woodland in the yellowing kind of leaves and also the bare branch areas. So they can show you, like say, lots of detail in an area. What they don't do very well, or at all really, is show you the difference in height. So variations in height is something which is information missing from an aerial photograph because it's taken directly from above. Oblique angle photographs, such as this one, are taken from an angle above the landscape looking down across it. So they can show you, and a benefit of them is they show you variations in height. So in this one, you've got Tower Bridge. You can clearly see the towers there. If you were looking at Tower Bridge from above, you wouldn't be able to see that these are taller than the surrounding area. And they also cover quite a large area. You can see quite far into the distance, 1 or 2, maybe 3 or 4 miles into the distance there from your sort of tall vantage point. So there's a large area and you can check variations in height. But one of the disadvantages is that if you've got tall things in the foreground, like these buildings here, you have no idea what's going on behind them. There could be a fun fair going on there. There could be a mugging going on. Okay, all things that are interesting information, which you can't see because they're concealed. So there's a disadvantage. And then the final type is ground level photographs. So in your case, it's in the thick rainforest jungle. In this case, this looks a bit like it could be oblique, but actually it only shows you the mountain in front of you. It doesn't really look further down into the valley. Now these are great because they provide good close-up detail. I can see, look, different plant species. I can see a little stream here which has got some white water. You might be able to see individual tree species, for example. But that's where the kind of usefulness ends, because you only have the limited amount of area in front of you to be able to analyse. So all of these photographs have benefits and disadvantages, and the reason you're learning about that really is for paper 3. Because in paper 3, you may well get asked about someone else's data. And so they might say, analyse this photograph and identify one advantage of this type of data presentation technique. Now, they're not asking you to tell me what the photograph means in terms of its findings or conclusions. They're just asking you to say what is useful about using this type of photograph in a geography fieldwork context. And they'll often put these sorts of questions around graph types. So you might get given a student's graph, like a scatter graph, and it will ask you, name a disadvantage with using a scatter graph. And you need to be aware of advantages and disadvantages. There is an entire revision PowerPoint which goes through the different geographical skills, including things like graph skills, where I do provide you with an advantage and disadvantage of basically every type of graph you could think of that you might encounter in paper 3. So if you want to do some revision for paper 3 and you want to learn some of the advantages, disadvantages of different data presentation techniques, get yourself over to that GCSE revision PowerPoint. But for now, on with tropical rainforests and their importance. So rainforests are important to us now because they provide us goods and services, and there's a wide variety there. You've got the carbon cycle, which is regulated by the tropical rainforest, known as the lungs of the earth, because they absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, and then they release oxygen. So they're really good at regulating the thing that is really causing us global warming at the moment. They also provide us with raw material goods, so timber for making furniture or other products. They help with regards to water regulation, more on that in a second. They're really good for crops and fruiting crops. They're home to lots of people, lots of native tribes. Biodiversity speaking, they are the most biodiverse land-based ecosystem, so they're incredibly useful to us and also provide us a rich variety of species. Ecotourism is another thing that they provide us, another service that the rainforests provide us to educate us about the species that might live there. I've already mentioned oxygen and drugs, okay? Bottles of pills don't grow on trees, but the trees themselves have chemical components which can be used to help treat certain illnesses. All right, so we need a bit more depth about the goods and services provided by the tropical rainforest, and look on 365 for the resources. Most of the resources are on 1 or 2 handouts available on there for you to use to help reduce the number of notes you might be taking in this session. So a definition first and foremost with regards to goods and services. Rainforest goods are generally things that the rainforest provides us that you can often mine, harvest or use directly, or often you can touch, not always, but most of the time. A service is something that the rainforest kind of does for us. Okay, so if I was to say go to Norwich, a good would be something I'd physically buy, like a book from Gerald's or something like that. A service would be something like going into a travel agent and they book you a holiday. You can't physically touch a holiday, but you can get someone to provide you with the flight details and the flight bookings and the hotel bookings, etc. So goods and services are slightly different. Now the rainforests provide us with lots of goods and lots of services, and they are all summarised in this table here with lots and lots of detail. Now I'm not going to read through that. What I'm going to ask you to do is make sure you've got a copy of this. It may well be on the handout, but if it's not, or you want to add any more detail, feel free, or if yours is mixed up, this is the correct order. You've got goods on the left-hand side, services on the right-hand side, and you've got a really good range of goods and services there available to you. So pause the screen, have a little read through those and make sure you're picking up some of the key details. So, the Amazon producing 2 billion tons, absorbing 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide every year, for example. Okay, so all of these illustrate just why the Amazon rainforest is massively, not just the Amazon, but the rainforests general as a biome are incredibly important to us. Climate change is something which is absolutely threatening that. Okay, so please excuse any noises in the background. It's just gone for lunchtime for year 7. So climate change is really, really threatening the things that make the rainforest important to us, and actually we're running the risk of losing a lot of the things that the rainforest provides for us. So a very quick intro to climate change, and there's more on this in the weather hazards and climate change topic. Climate change is the large-scale, long-term shift in the planet's weather patterns or average temperatures. That's the wordy definition. Basically, it's something which affects the world. The Earth has obviously got tropical climates, and it's had different ice ages and warmer periods over its 4.5 billion year history. But what's currently happening is that the Earth is warming up. Over the last 11,000 years, the climate has been basically hovering around 14 degrees Celsius on average. But recently, that average temperature has been going up and up. Not massively, but enough to cause fairly significant differences in weather patterns. So, how is it affecting the tropical rainforest? Well, in short, it's making the tropical rainforest drier and hotter in many, many areas. And that means that the climate of the tropical rainforest isn't what it used to be, and that change will drastically, potentially anyway, affect the structure of the rainforest, which we looked at with the tall trees, the canopy, etc. The function of the rainforest, so the things that it does for us, and also the biodiversity, the range of plant species and animal species that can survive there. So the handout you've got has got a nice summary of all of these with varying activities, which I'm going to talk about throughout the rest of this PowerPoint. So look out for that, make sure you've got it in front of you. So starting with the changes to structure, what's likely to happen to the tropical rainforest long term is that climate change will stop it being a tropical rainforest and make it a more seasonal tropical forest. So still in the tropics, but now seasonal means that it has a drier season and maybe a wetter season, or a period of time where it doesn't rain. And that's not normal for a rainforest, hence why they're called rainforests. So a seasonal forest is different because there may be a dry season that lasts even months in some cases, and that is bad news because the species aren't adapted to survive it. So this is sort of a current rainforest species with, you can see its buttress roots there to allow for it to get lots of nutrients from the soil, but also support its growth high up through the canopy. But this is a species of tree that you might expect to see in a seasonal tropical forest or savanna. This is a baobab tree. And the swollen trunk there is where it stores its water. So when it's got a dry season, it's able to kind of use that water store to survive until it rains again. And the species on the left don't have that luxury. So what I'd like you to do now is, once you've looked at your sheet and worked out the structure changes section, I've got consequences of the climate change to the tropical rainforest on the left-hand side, and I've developed and extended or linked that consequence to another answer, so to improve that answer. All you need to do is link up the correct head to the correct tail. So pause the screen, do that, and then I'll quickly go through the answers. Okay, so the first one links up to the bottom one. So there'll be much less vegetation in the dry season than normal in the tropical rainforest, and because of that less vegetation, herbivores might have to adapt to hibernate because there's not enough food. Okay, as the water is stored deeper underground because there's less vegetation, it's able to sink more. It means that certain species, like the baobab tree, but not necessarily that tree, but species will have to evolve to maybe store more water in their trunks during the dry season. Evergreen trees don't tend to drop their leaves, so these evergreen trees might have to adapt to becoming, or the species that might thrive there will be ones that are able to drop their leaves to avoid water loss, again, during that dry season. Now, if the leaves go in the canopy, the understory and the shrub layer can start to develop, and that completely changes the structure of the rainforest, because the shrub layer is normally made up of these sort of large-leaved ferns, whereas now it might allow smaller tree species to come and change the structure of the rainforest there. And then finally, falling leaves, if they do fall in a dry spell, might mean the litter store becomes a lot deeper and may not decompose as often or as quickly as previously. So the next part we're going to be looking at is changes to the function of the tropical rainforest due to climate change. And again, this is a section on your handout. So what I'd like you to do is extend these points. Okay, so I've started these points for you, and unlike the last one, which is the structure changes, where I gave you the extension, I want you to see if you can come up with some kind of logical extension to the starting impact to function. So you've got 4 impacts there. Less vegetation, meaning there's less infiltration, so less water going into the soil, and more of it runs off. So what could a consequence of that be? Less transpiration, so water coming away from the plants, means there's less chance of water vapor going into the atmosphere, so what knock-on effect might that have? Less vegetation on mountains, so the trees don't absorb the moisture from the clouds that pass, called cloud stripping. So if the trees aren't absorbing that moisture, where is that moisture going? What impacts might that have? And obviously drier forests can either burn, and there's more forest fires, and they'll actually emit more CO2 than they take in and absorb. So what could be the knock-on effects of that? So pause the screen, take your time to do that. It should take you a good 10 to 15 minutes to come up with some good extended points there, and then I'll go through some suggestions. Okay, so we'll go through the first one one by one. Less vegetation means that you could get more soil erosion, you could get flooding, They might put more sediment into rivers because it washes off into the rivers, which can also lead to flooding. It might damage the river habitats that aren't used to having all that sediment. So they're all possible answers and possible extended points. Less transpiration, so it means there's probably going to be less rainfall in the rainforest, and that could lead to drought in the rainforest and obviously have knock-on effects for other species. Less vegetation on mountains means that the water doesn't get absorbed and it moves the water somewhere else, and it doesn't necessarily then rain into that area. It will make the rain go somewhere else, and that's bad because the rainforest relies on rain. And lastly, drier forests will emit more CO2. I mean, any comment about climate change being made worse or less reduction of CO2 from the atmosphere is worthwhile. And there's a fact here that the 2005 and 2010 Amazon droughts, which were periods without lots of rainfall, which is again unusual, but becoming more usual, actually added 5 billion tonnes of CO2 to the atmosphere. Okay, if you want to get any notes on those, pause the screen. I'm going to move on, but you can add to your notes from these. Okay, so finally, the changes to biodiversity. And here's a nice, cute picture of the flying foxbat. And they're relevant because, unfortunately, they have a bit of a tragic story. So drier conditions in tropical rainforests means that plants aren't actually adapted to survive those droughts or forest fires, and you're going to find that lots of plants in those areas will die, and only the ones able to survive will survive, and they'll thrive, and that reduces the variety of wildlife, and that's what biodiversity is. So biodiversity is a great thing because of all the drugs and medicines it provides us, and also the education and the research that can go into it. But as you get more of what's called a monoculture, less variety of wildlife, you reduce that opportunity to discover new things. So that's not great. So those plants won't survive those conditions, and only some of them will. Also, they're less able to cope with the temperatures that vary. So tropical rainforests have a very similar temperature year round. As the temperatures vary more, they get hotter, those tree species might also survive, or plant species might not survive, and animals might not survive. And this is where the flying foxbats come in. Because of the higher heat that's been found in certain tropical rainforest areas, the flying foxbats are just basically dropping out the tree, dying, and there's piles and piles of them at the base of their roost or where they live. And it's really, really tragic. If you look up on the news, you'll find some good news stories about it, but have a tissue ready because it's pretty sad. Plants that can survive the changes, we've already mentioned this, will thrive, and they'll outcompete all the other tropical rainforest plants. So you'll find you'll get less variety, and again, less variety has those negative knock-on effects with discoveries and research. And pests and diseases. If you get changing conditions, different parasites and bacteria and things that can infect trees and plants and animals will survive or will come in. And those animals and plants aren't immune to those. And because they're not immune, unfortunately, they will die out. So again, reducing biodiversity. And lastly, what you might find is that species migrate from the lower levels, where it's drier, to the higher levels on mountains, rainforests on mountains, where it's still a bit cooler because of altitude, reducing that temperature and increasing maybe moisture. But because they're all trying to compete and migrate, it will again affect biodiversity because they won't all be able to survive. They'll all be trying to kind of fight against each other in a smaller area. So again, climate change is really just bad news for biodiversity in the rainforest all round. Right, this is quite a detailed PowerPoint, and you've got your handout with loads and loads of detail on it. And what I'd like you to do with that is produce an assessment. Now, pause the screen, or when you're ready, pause the screen. Everything you need to know about what you need to include is on this screen right now. Okay, so if you get a chance to get the textbooks, pages 136 and 137 of the Highland Cow textbook are the ones that provide you with some detail, but you can also use the internet if you're pretty good at researching stuff. All right. Now, I'd like you to produce an electronic version. Doesn't have to be an actual web page, just something that is essentially a summary document that assesses both the importance of the tropical rainforest and with a really big focus, and this is why it's a big chunk of this particular lesson, on how climate change can affect the tropical rainforest ecosystem with regards to its structure, its function, and its biodiversity. So really, you're producing a detailed but good summary that shows your understanding of everything we've covered in this session. I'm not going to say much more about that. The assessment sheet should be on 365. If it's not, email me and I'll send you one. But best of luck with it. If you've completed it and you want to send it electronically, please make sure you put it into the hand-in area on 365. But good luck. This is, like I say, a very tricky part of this topic. And if you can get this right for tropical rainforests, a lot of the same ideas can be transferred across to our next biome, which is deciduous forests. So spend a good couple of weeks doing this, produce it, and I'll give you good feedback and potentially a grade for this as well, to give you to put a grade onto the system. Next session, we're still looking at tropical rainforests, so it's not the end of those now, and we're going to be looking at one more lesson on a case study of the Amazon, about how we can manage the tropical rainforests to try and help make it a more sustainable place. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.